you feeling? I'm going to move on to it now in 1 second and give us a shout, people. Welcome. How are you doing? We are recording. James, Mister, how are you doing, sir? It was Damascus of Syria, I believe is what I called you before, but I now have learned that you're actually from the north of England, so it's a pleasure to meet you. How are you doing today, sir?
I'm very well. It's a pleasure to meet you too. An absolute pleasure. What are we going to be talking about today precisely? Because you just
Well,
dragged me in here and gone, let's just make some content.
okay, right. Well, I think we've discussed it before, though. But we've got we've got an egg to crack. We've got something that we need to express. A little gem that we found within the context of Ion by Carl Jung. So we're here to present to you a nugget of an idea, and I have some intuitions what it could be, but and who may be delivering it, but I'm not too sure. But I think if I was to put it into like a sentence or something like that, I'd stick strictly with the idea of the Christian psychology, the psychology of Christianity, somewhat updated. I guess you could say the meme we kind of hit on in those Ion lectures that people keep bringing up to us over and over and again, and I think it's worth re-exploring this and actually articulating it in, say, one place to make it as fulfilled as possible. So I guess I got to ask you, like, what's your take on all this? I know you've prepared plenty for this, so you've got a lot of thought, but like, how would you build up this foundation? How would you talk about it in that sense?
Yeah, it is a good question because it all comes down to what's right and what's wrong. And is there an objective right and wrong? And lots of people like to think that there is, but as they grow older and they start to explore more decadent lifestyles, they rebel against their parents. They're like, I can do whatever I want and they can break free of it. But there have been some great thinkers in the past who've, we could say, defended the whole Christian idea of there being an objective morality. Because, of course, if you're living under, we'll say, the Jewish God, which then became the Christian God, you have the idea of certain laws being God's laws. And if you break those laws, that's bad, and God will ruin your life. You know, you burn in all eternity in hell. But then as we've gone along in time, we found it very difficult to believe in the existence of God. So does that mean that the morality itself becomes arbitrary? Certain fantastic thinkers have come along and gone, no, it's not the case. It's not an arbitrary thing. It might be a unspoken law of the psyche, or it might be a very, very deeply programmed, I guess, cultural operating system within you. But there are certain things you can do, and there are certain things that you can't do. It's not a case of just layering it on yourself. And that's a very interesting foundation on which to tackle this stuff from, which you don't normally hear about in things like academia and in the media. It's generally a case of, do what you feel like. It doesn't matter. And then Jung comes along and sort of slaps you and goes, shut the fuck up.
Shut up, mate. Liverpool Young comes in. He gets his North instincts on. He's like, oh, all right, you nonce. none of that, mate. None of that. Go down to Greg's and try to do what you feel like, and you get slapped around by Baza pretty fucking fast. All right, mate.
My favorite northern insult is minger. That's always been my favorite.
Oh, you're a minger,
mate. You're minging.
Yeah, you're minging. Fantastic. Yeah, I've heard that before. That's a great one. Fuck it, she's minging, mate. She's minging. This is generally morality is what we're going to be hitting into here, people, a lot. We're going to be talking about, the sexiest topic of all, morality, which what everybody wants to hear about when they go out to the club. They want to hear about morality. They want to just like riff through there, and they want to just like, instead of like a beat coming on there by the DJ, he wants to get dropped a podcast about morality. So we're here to supply the people Saturday night with some like heavy duty dancing content, if you will. But I'm
not actually joking about this. I used to talk about morality to people all the time, and I used to just go down to the pubs to drink. Like, everyone else would go off afterwards to the clubs, and I would just sit there and be like, do you want to tell me about sort of the meaning of life? Have you thought about sexual promiscuity before and why you shouldn't do it? I became a very, very unpopular person. But if I'm like any of the people listening to this right now, there is that innate hunger for something like that, almost as if you want something, an invisible hand in the sky, psychologized or not, to say, don't do this. We want to have those restrictions around certain things.
It is very interesting. It is very interesting because I guess what we hit on in some sense is the re-articulation of the reality of moral behavior. Like, we're going to get into it now, and we're going to talk about a lot about how our worldview saw what was in the Christian myth and how it seemed to be quite pragmatic in some sense. But the fundamental question is, we're talking about the moral instinct. It's very weird because the world we live in right now is very much like, do what you like, live in the moment, act on impulse. It's almost very, very dictated by the market in some sense, because the market in a weird way is like this rush to the bottom. you're going to be successful if you can exploit someone's insecurities, if you can target someone's, I guess you could say, base nature. And this all comes from like theorists and I guess practitioners like Edward Bernays, who are always saying that the end result of persuasion and propaganda and mass marketing and all that is to find the deep beast within inside people that wants status, wants sexual validation, wants power, and wants food, and speak to that thing in some sense. And I guess since we've been through like 70 years of that, some people get a little bit jaded. And no matter, even during the course of that, like people are always challenged with moral questions, like what's the right thing to do, what's the wrong thing to do, what's the correct way to relate to my my inner juice. Like, should I release the beast, or should I have a conversation with the beast in the pub instead of going out to Saturday night? So who knows? It's a big question. And the place I want to start it, of course, is discussing morality, discussing that issue of choice. And this stuff is very heady and abstract, so I always try to bring it down as pragmatic as possible. And it does come.
Can you explain what's going on in this photograph for me? Because what I can see is there's a bunch of sort of pretty ladies, and then you got this naked man playing a lute.
This is actually from Greek myth, because I'm going to start talking a little bit about the more primitive version of morality. You might be able to see Apollo and the Boyos up there.
Oh, very nice indeed. Yeah, I'm just concerned about this naked man with a lute. I was going to say, is this okay to be naked in public? Is this sort of the stand you want to take in this video?
No, this is actually a shot from a club in North Manchester, and this dude is actually like banging out a tune on the lute, and these are all
That is spot on. That is spot on. You don't even know. That is, 100%.
Yeah, that's it, man. And then like look at all the little babies. They were probably conceived like recently here or something like that. And it's just like the girls are, oh, let's go down to the club, mate. And then just throw the kid on the floor, have a bit of a bop to the lute, like so. So that's what's going on. Nice. It's that question towards a goal is what I'm getting at in terms of the moral thing. I talked about before that you need to be aiming for something in order to understand what you're like. You do things to get something. That's how it works. You always behave in order to achieve. And the question then is, what is right and wrong? And then when you're going down, like, you know, and listening to the lute player there in the club and all that, and your goal is very straightforward. You want to have fun, or you want to have like pleasure. It's very, you could say, transient and straightforward and simple and all that. And I guess there's a place for that. Like people like the Greek would have Dionysian instincts in order to express that and all that. But there is sort of this sense of after all Saturday night fades away into the transience of time, you're sort of asking yourself, like, what was I doing? Where am I going with myself? Should I really just be popping out North babies on the floor of the club? They're
very, very, very quick turnaround between conception and birth. That's almost disgusting.
I think it's a high sign of the fertility of the North, you know, that they can just be like pop them out literally like a machine gun. It's just you just have to release them.
Yeah, it's making me feel quite uncomfortable, to be honest.
So I guess when you ask that bigger question, it's like, where are we going? What am I doing with myself and all that stuff? Well, what is the purpose of all my actions? Because if you're just like instant gratification, eventually you kind of start to run into a roadblock. You see this in people all the time. They're like, what am I doing with myself?
100%. I was at university, used to hang out with people a lot older than me, like 5 years older than me, and a lot of them, by the end of the time I was with them, was like, I need to turn my life around, man. I'm not happy was the big thing. Like they would, go out 5, 6, 7, 9, 12, 20 times a week, whatever, and then they'd come back and be like, yeah, but I'm kind of poor, and my girlfriends keep dumping me, and I'm high off cocaine all the time. That's probably not a way to live. So it's like a voice in your head going, stop being a prick, basically.
And that's a very strange thing, because Jordan Peterson talks about this a lot, but it's a very strange thing where you're getting a load of pleasure. Like cocaine is just raw pleasure, dude. Like it's just like,
I wouldn't know, man. I wouldn't know.
Well, it's it's a chemical that replicates your pleasure creating emotions in your face, pretty much. So you just like stuff that shit into your face. It goes into your brain and makes you think that you're like on this like up. It makes you think you're in that last 20 minutes of the game and you're winning like all the time. So you're just running around. It's like just counting the clock down. You're like, I'm about to win. And you're just in that mood until it ends. And it's like permanent pleasure, I guess, in a sense. And what's weird is it's great when you're doing it, but then the crash comes and all that, and then you sort of ask why Why was I doing it? What game was I winning? Oh, it turns out that I was doing nothing but chugging out North babies, and they're only a painting as well. Like, so what's going on here? And so there is that question of like, what's the future I'm working towards? And I, of course, talk about like heaven would be the beautiful one full of success and health, and then hell, I guess, is what happens when you make the wrong choices and you end up in somewhere negative. But we can get into that later. Any thoughts, by the way? Anything like you'd like to sprinkle on there, Boyo?
No, not at the current time. I'm enjoying this so far. Keep on plowing forth, as they say.
Plowing, yes.
Plowing, long, hard, and deep.
So even though we understand all this stuff intellectually, it's like, oh, you should do the right thing to bring yourself towards heaven, and if you keep going to the lute concerts, you'll eventually.
Hang on, you're gonna have to break down this photo for me as well, dude. So the lute player, it looks like he's just gone completely bollock naked. Is it like he's got his testicles out, just sitting in the rainforest? Is this what you do after a cocaine trip?
Well, he was naked beforehand, but like you get burnt out. Like, so you can see he was like banging out the lute there, and all the girls were partying, and all his kids were lying on the floor, and fucking Apollo the sun showed up to be like, Jesus, dude, that's a great tune. But now the boyo, he's just sort of, look at him, he's just sitting there and he's just sort of being like, what the fuck am I doing, Brad? And he's asking this.
I think that happened to, I might be making this up completely, I probably am, but Sam Harris, I think, said in one of his talks that he once washed up on the beach, I think after an LSD trip in a separate country. I think it might have been in his book, Waking Up. But yeah, that's what he said. Is like he had like a crazy night and woke up washed up on the beach. Sam Harris, I know you watch this. You can confirm in the comments, please.
Yeah, perhaps, dude. Yeah, perhaps. Yeah. Well, I guess he's probably in the same position. He's sort of washed up. He was on his rock, and now he's back in his rock, but he's not playing lute anymore. He's like, what am I doing with life? And there's the temptation from the siren. The siren's pointing at the dog and be like, go nut in the dog, or something like that. And he's like, no, dude, no, wham, please. And then this guy's sort of being like, knowledge or something like that, maybe a higher order. Maybe he is a representative of us, and we'll get into this idea of the conscience later. So that could be what's going on there.
Very profound.
The point is that like this boyo is like us. His whole life, people have been like, you must be a moral person, you must be a good person, you must, and it's all very abstract. And you're like, fuck off, dude. Like, have you ever been to a real loot party where it goes down and someone brings out the cocaine? You know nothing. Stop talking shit. Leave me alone. But then at some point you need to get practical. And this is what I noticed about the Christian story, is that it's a very practical way to get you in touch with this stuff, because it presents to you, I guess you could say, the correct images to fill in your archetypes. I'll get into that a little bit more. But it's, as we said, it's as I'm saying here, it's simple and it's sophisticated. It's a very straightforward story. Like, you only need a very small amount of ideas in order to help you think about the world properly. Like, for example, you know the one, God in the sky who can see everything. That's actually, if you believe that, that will make you act moral, no matter what. It's almost like, like if you believe that when you're like in private and someone's watching you, then you'll sort of act moral in that way. So you can see how these things work. And so our question was, we can't really believe in God anymore. We just can't completely have that conviction anymore. We have a bit of a struggle. But Jung put together a way for us perhaps to be a little bit more in touch with what that would have provided for people, moral guidance, if you will, by understanding, I guess, the archetypes and psychology and all this stuff. Any thoughts before I go on, sir?
Yeah. So I guess a little bit on Jung's frame here. There's no real big test of how you can confirm this whole Christian conscience idea. It's a huge problem because we can't really verify the existence of God. But there is a question you can ask yourself, and you have to answer sincerely, which is like, if the law breaks down, are you going to continue to be a good person? And what the hell does good mean in that particular instance? Because this is what the whole story Crime and Punishment was about, which is incredibly profound, where the guy Raskolnikov, he rationalized to himself that God didn't exist and I can do whatever the hell I want. And so he went ahead and killed an old woman for great benefit, right? But the question still remains is, once the law breaks down, is there something there to control what you do? And of course, the thesis in Crime and Punishment was, even if you think you can go and you can break those ultimate moral laws, like thou shalt not kill, your psychology will not let you get away with it, right? And that's where that sort of architecture builds up within you. If there's no outside influence, which is the point, then only an inside influence is going to stop you from doing the right and the wrong thing, which means that within your psychology, within your collective unconscious, there is a moral order to things. And so that's where the existence of God is in a Jungian sense.
Yes, we'll get into that now in a bit. But the archetype, the way we got to understand our psychology in order to make this stuff relevant is Jung's theory of archetypes becomes very useful. He says you can imagine it the sort of evolutionary psychology way and say that we've evolved to adapt to reality, and the way we see our reality is imagining that there's certain patterns, like pattern recognition over millions of years made us understand that if there's a kingdom that we're fighting for, we will have meaning in our life. You know, our nation, the Roman state, the Christian kingdom of Europe, whatever you want to call it. The Jews have Israel, for example. America has America, patriotism and all that. You know, that's like an instinct that is directed at an image. You could think of it that way. And it's very interesting because it's rock solid. Like, people do this, and you can go out and you can find it everywhere, and you can find what people are debating about in politics and all that is around this kingdom. But another prominent archetype is this idea of the hero. You've heard about this before. Joseph Campbell's like the hero with 1,000 faces. When you're a young dude and you see like some fighter doing really well, or some guy doing really, really well, you look up to him. Like, what the fuck does that even mean? You get inspired by him. You see him as a hero in some sense. And he actually becomes, in some sense, a guidance towards your morality. Now, that's a fascinating idea, because when you're a young dude, you don't know what the fuck you're going to do. Like, you have no idea what's right or wrong. You're just like, you've literally just got this beast inside you that's being like, go with the Norths, little James. Go with the Norths. Go with the Norths to Greg's. Like,
I'm not commenting on that.
And
neither is my dog. My dog's not going to comment on your nonsense either.
And you get dragged into Greg's, you know, if you obey those instincts. But sometimes you need someone to look up to. And I guess what I'm trying to say here is that we imitate better than we innovate. We can't kind of sit there and recontextualize an entire new morality and a new set of archetypes to lead us forward when you're just like a 19-year-old idiot. Like, you don't know anything. I didn't need, like, the worst thing you could do to me when I was 19 is sit me down and tell me to think all this stuff true. And in some sense, I've sort of done that because our current world is in such a crisis that it's pushing it on all of us to do that. But that's very difficult, and that's very counterproductive to the instincts of a man, or even like a woman, in that you need to act and you need to get yourself set up in your youth in some sense. And so we imitate.
So that's a very pertinent point, actually, about sitting a young man down, for example. We have a powerful instinct to rebel against our parents and rebel against the natural order of things. But the archetype theory, this idea of a collective unconscious, is you're not the only one that exists in your psychic space. There are other things, and they're more powerful than you, and you have no choice but to obey them. So it's in contrast, I suppose, to a more will to power idea where you can assert your will. But whereas the Jungian frame is more, there is that you do have a will and you can do whatever you want, but your will has to be aligned with the intuitive moral compass of the archetypes, or else you're going to be destroyed. And that's something which Dostoevsky was tapping into, you could say, which is your psychology doesn't allow you to get away with certain things. Now, of course, the Dostoevsky idea is killing, which you can say is like an extreme idea. But this is where it comes into the idea of the conscience, I guess, guiding you through each and every different thing that you do. And Jung had a very interesting idea of what the conscience specifically was and how that tied into Christ. But spoilers, we'll get into that a bit later. Carry on, Stefan. I enjoy your spiel.
Well, that is a good point, because, like, you know, if you're into going down to the loot parties with all the Norths, and you do that for like your 20s. So every day you're like every day, like, let's not even hold back at all. It's not Saturday, it's not the weekend. You just literally go every day and you go bopping with the Norths, and what will happen is you'll burn out and you'll hit 30 as a young man. Like, and the idea as a young man is that you kind of want to sacrifice your 20s to an extent. You don't want to go crazy, but in some sense, like, your 20s are your foundation. That's when you build your body. That's when you build the grounding of your future and all this stuff. And if you just go out and you bop like crazy, there's rare occasions where that can work out, when if you're like Jim Morrison or something like that. But generally speaking, you're going to burn out and you're going to hit 30 and you're going to be a loser and you're going to have nothing going for you. You're going to, after destroying your health, and worst of all, you'll only start that crisis then, and that time, and you'll be so cynical from having burned out your dopamine receptors with all the coke that, in some sense, you'll be in a bad place. You're gonna have a lot bigger of a dragon, if we will, to fight against. It's gonna be a lot harder and all that. And so,
Well, here's an interesting question, I guess. Do you think that there are people who are in that lifestyle? They are going out, God knows how many times a week. They are spending all of their paycheck on horrible, hard drugs that don't have a conscience and don't have an inkling that they should be improving themselves. Do you think there's a universal thing, or there are some people who legitimately are like, I literally just want to burn myself out with pleasure? There is no right and wrong.
Yeah, well, there's plenty of people like that. There's loads. Like, I guess this is kind of hard to describe. It's that, like, when you do that, you start to pull yourself into that worldview, and we're gonna get into this a bit more. Is like you start to give yourself over to a different mode of thinking, because it's strange. You can't be, you can't be clubbing with the loot in the loot parties, and it's hard to do that a lot and maintain what you could call a long-term action perspective. It becomes very difficult after a while, because
but do you think that voice ever completely disappears? I guess is what I'm intrigued about. Obviously, the voice, you won't answer the voice, and so it might get louder sometimes, maybe in the beginning, to go stop being a pillock. But then as you go on with it, I guess the voice will dim and dim. You stop listening to it. But do you think it will ever actually go away?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm not too sure. Like, that's a big question. I'm not too sure.
Because you could say in which case that the conscience is an omnipresent, objective piece of reality.
It could be. I'm not sure. I haven't really thought that through at all. It makes sense that it would dim, but it would never die. That would be, and this is where we're going to start getting into it. Like, it's like that conscience, that inner voice that's being like, stop partying in Greg's. That's almost like
Do you even know what Greg's is?
Yeah, it's a sandwich bar. Like, I just imagine like a loot there, and then they're all eating sandwiches and watching the match and drinking pints and being like, but that's probably not true. Yeah.
No, that's not far off. That's really not that far off.
So that conscience is, I guess you could say, the archetype of do the right thing, and that can be like Jesus pretty much is that for most people, who, especially if they're Christian or European, especially in that sense. So he's there being like, stop nutting all around the walls and all that stuff, and do other stuff. And so maybe you can kill him off, but he never really dies. Or maybe that's when you get those peak like scary stories of people who say, I'm going to give myself completely over to the dark force or something like that. Like, is that what the Faustian deal is that final moment where you finally sacrifice the conscience to, I guess, someone else's plan? We'll get into that now in a second. So it's a very interesting thought. Nonetheless, to kind of pull us back to what we were saying, you have a hero that sort of represents that conscience. When you look up to like a Chad warrior, you're saying to yourself, okay, sweet, what's right to do is always to defeat the bad guys, to conquest, to be strong, to be ruthless, to be powerful. And so the powerful Greek hero, like, that's how the Greeks would have seen it. They would have seen, Hercules, and and what is right is to be more like Hercules, to be more brave, to be more strong, to be more domineering. What is right is the expression of strength and power and all that stuff. And if you, whatever behavior you're going to do, the right choice is always to act like this hero Hercules, and he will bring us towards a brighter future and all that. And this is quite true. But then there's this problem where, over time, as society gets bigger, and say you move more towards a super society that we live in now, where if you run out and you're just like raw domination, it will take you far, but it won't take you far enough. And it's not really a good founding idea for a super society. Like, people can't work if they're violently trying to dominate each other. You need to, in some sense, develop a new concept of what the conscience is. And this is where we start getting into the idea of a new hero. And this is where we get into the idea of, like, would Christ represent this hero? So you have that problem of what would Hercules do when you're a young man? Oh, what should I do? I don't know what to do. What am I going to do? And then you say, okay, I'll do what Hercules does, and that's always to fight and be strong and all this. But then as we get into the new Ion, if you will, the new era, that was when the population of the earth got over like a couple of 100 million, then you start to say to yourself, okay, maybe Hercules isn't the way forward. Maybe we need something else. And this is where Jesus shows up and says, I am the new way. And through me, you will understand what to do. And that's the what would Jesus do frame.
It would be an interesting question as well, I guess. Do you think you can pick your heroes? because if I look at the heroes I've had over the course of my life, they've been quite eclectic. I remember the very first one I had, I was about 11. It's a guy called Nigel Marven. He was a zookeeper on the TV. He had this TV series where he made a prehistoric park. It was absolutely class. I was like, I want to be this man because I want to live with the dinosaurs, and that would be brilliant. But then, I didn't pick that, and obviously it doesn't serve anything. But as I grew older, it started to become more, I'd say, like traditionally masculine men. So when you were saying like maybe this hero doesn't work, do you think you can pick a hero and it would resonate with you like that? Or do you think it has to be a spontaneous thing?
Oh, I think it definitely has to be spontaneous. I don't think you can really choose your heroes. Like,
so we'll be entering into sort of an objectivity around what a hero could be then in that case.
Yeah, well, I think the most important point to drive home there is that, and this is the kind of scary idea of it, is that you don't really choose this stuff. Like, you are inspired by patterns in the world. And when you see, for example, Tyler Durden from Fight Club has this quality about him where you're drawn to him. And before you watched Fight Club, you didn't read, like, you were just asleep to that. It's not like you were sitting there when you're watching Fight Club and it's like, God, I hope this movie has a hero that's going to give me a vision of how I should act in the future. Instead, what happens is you watch it and you're just like captivated. And you're like, whoa, I want to be like that dude. I want to be like that dude. And so I guess what we're saying is that, like, once men reach a very high level of psychological sophistication, they see what Jesus did and they're like, fuck, I want to do that. Or I don't think I've ever achieved anything as good as that. And that's like a very high standard. It starts to set up a higher standard. And this is where we're getting into the psychology of this, is that once he sets such a high standard, you start to, and it roots in your conscience. You get inspired by it. Like, once you watch Fight Club and you see Tyler Durden, you start to get angry at yourself for being a bitch. Whereas beforehand, you might have been a lot more like permissive. Like, someone would push over you and you'd sort of be like, well, this is what I've always been like. You wouldn't even think about, you're unconscious. Tyler Durden kind of pulls you out of that and you're like, oh God, I got to stand up to that dude. And then that's a good thing. Then your conscience is now updated. And then what happens is you come in contact with this Christ story, and then your conscience, does it update again? Or does it translate to a new software? What's happening there? And so, like James is saying, it's not like you can turn around and be like, I would like to install update Nietzsche and Superman or whatever. It's almost like you need to get struck by lightning in some sense. And that is why Christ has this powerful effect, because he seemed to just come out of nowhere. And everybody was like, whoa, this dude got something to him. This dude's got something to him.
Yeah. I'd love to see a study on that, actually, too, because you probably, what are the top 10 heroes if you could go across all men and then all women, because they'd be different between the two of them, I would imagine. Probably have Arnold Schwarzenegger at the very, very, very top. But it's interesting as well because most of the time, and this is a Nietzschean idea, it's not the words that you say, it's like your essence of character. Like Nietzsche had a great quote about adding style to your character, so that when people would look at you, they'd see a sculpture, as if you'd actually sculpt yourself properly. And anything that was too ugly and too incel-y, you just smooth it over a bit so that you sort of just look beautiful in the distance. But it's why like young men resonate with him over Kant. Like, how many young men go, I really admire Kant? They don't, because he's like lacking in essence. So there will be, I'm sure there will be a canonical series of personality traits that everyone wishes that they had, that's objective and resonates spontaneously.
Yeah.
There you can have sort of the beginnings of an objective morality, which is very, very exciting.
Yes, absolutely. And you start to reach that very big question of like what would these things, like, you're building a hero, I guess, in a sense, and you're not building a hero through like, I will build a hero. You're sort of observing what heroes are and deducting a meta hero, as they talk about. And so the idea we're kind of drilling here is that Christ perhaps sat on that throne the best, and that's why he did so well. Now the way this manifests in a large extent is this idea of the way this most practically manifests, and this is why I keep trying to push this idea that all this shit is abstract, but the way it comes out practically is very interesting, because first of all, this is not your choice. It's not rational in a sense. It's more to do with emotion, instinct, feeling, and the conscience thing, which I guess you could say is a feeling. And if you notice your reality when you're walking through it, what actually happens, like, it's not like Jesus is your reason And that's what's interesting about it. Jesus isn't the voice of reason per se. What you'll notice is you're walking through your day and you've got this little bullshit rationality talk and be like, daddly da da da, there you go, off to Greg's, do all this stuff, do this, ba 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 ba. But then what's actually happening is you're struck with when you're struck with a choice, like say, I don't know, say there's an old lady crossing the road and you see it and you're da 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 da, and there's like a lot of cars. And then what happens is you kind of freeze a bit because you notice that. It's like an anomaly. You notice that and you're like, uh-oh, there's something there. And what happens is part of you, I guess you could say your momentum is saying, keep going. Should be all right. Keep going. And it's like, charge on to do what you're going to do. And then another part of you just like whispers, like a little fucker. It just turns around and says, you should really go help that woman. And you know that little voice is right. You know it's right. You know it's right. But you sort of like say, you sort of pretend to yourself, I didn't hear that. That didn't happen.
Yes.
So you're sort of like, no, that wasn't. I didn't hear nothing.
Yeah, I had a scenario like that actually a couple of days ago. There's a few doors you have to get into before you reach my apartment. And like the very first, we'll say the first time this happened, I went through and there was someone who was struggling with bags, but I was in quite a sour mood. So I didn't like open the door for them. I was just like, no, fuck you. I was in one of those moods where I kind of wanted to shut the door behind me, so they had to go to more effort to open it, you know, being really obnoxious. And I was such a bad mood, but it hit me after I did it. Like, why did you do that? Like, why did you do that? And then the next time this happened, someone's struggling with bags. They were like a couple of days apart. I open the door, they go, oh, thank you so much. And I get my nice warm, tingly, I'm a good person now, I did it. But where the hell is that coming from? Why?
It's weird.
Why is that saying help this person with the door?
Yeah,
because that's it's not like share your food with a starving man. You can understand that on a Darwinian basis. Like, I share my food with you, and when you get better, you share your food with me. But to open a door for you while you're struggling, it's like that's a bit of a leap to use that same circuit, in my opinion. So where does that come from?
Yeah, it's weird. And I like, again, I don't want to get into the abstracts of why it happens. I want to stick phenomenological. I want to talk about the experience. And I've noticed that it comes in that little niggling voice that you hear, but you pretend, it's so weird. You pretend yourself you don't hear it, and you try to tell yourself that it's not real, or it's not true, or it's not correct. Like, what you do is your mind will rationalize. So it will say, you should just help that lady, something bad could happen. And your mind will say, she'll be fine. Your mind rationalizes, she'll be fine. And what you have to do is very interesting. You have to ignore your mind and give yourself over to this inner voice. And you've known millions of experiences like this. I can even give like a sort of non-Christian version of this, but there's a beautiful woman and you see her. And what happens is you get this kind of like schizophrenic experience where you get this thrust of fear. You're like, oh my God, she is intimidatingly beautiful, right? And then your rationalizing mind like listens. It's weird. It's almost like your rationalizing mind has to choose between one of these, and it will support whichever one it goes for. So when this jump of fear comes, your rationalizing mind goes, oh, she's probably busy. She's probably on her way to work. She probably wouldn't like me anyway. Oh, it'll be so embarrassing. Everybody's probably watching. And then there's a little voice in the back of your head just goes, you should definitely go talk to her. And you're like, oh, why did you say that? Why? Because you know it's right. But it's like, dude, go talk to her. Come on. Like, don't be a coward. And you're like, shut the fuck up. And then it gets louder. It's like, go talk to her. And then you try to bury it. You try to rationalize with this stuff to protect yourself from that. But then if you give yourself over to it and you say, okay, I'll do it anyway, and you kind of go through the Eros, the fear, your rationalizing mind will start to kind of switch onto its side. And even if you go and you can actually go all the way through with it, your rationalizing mind will turn to this thing and kind of be like, well done, you did that, you're a beast, well done, you're the best, and all this. And so the kind of inner monologue supports this, and it's almost like you've got these two instincts fighting. You've got on one side this conscience, whatever the fuck it is, and the other side you've got this Eros. And I'm describing them here as Logos and Eros. We've talked about this many times before. You've got this inner voice that is principled about getting results in the future, about doing the right thing, whatever that might be in whatever the context. And then the other one is Eros, which is more about instant gratification, protect you from negative experience, I guess more pleasure orientated. And you can put this in a Christian frame. You can, as I said, you can put this in just a very practical frame with like you know, a girl or something like that. You're afraid, but Logos does it anyway, whereas Eros cucks to the fear. Eros gives in to the base emotion that's coming through. So these are very, very big questions and super interesting. Any thoughts?
Well, if you want to put this in a Christian framework, it's very, very interesting, because you could imagine someone, say a devout Catholic, they would say that Christ is the voice of reason in that instance. Don't talk to the girl, because the girl is sin. She's just walking sin. All she wants is your nut dust, and she's going to give nothing back. Don't do it. Your nut dust belongs to the Lord. Whereas the actual Jungian frame, where if you take the conscience being the equivalent of Christ internalized, or you could call it the Holy Spirit if you want to, it would say that approaching the girl is what you should do, because it's overcoming fear. It's making the unconscious conscious, so that you become a stronger man. So it's like, that's, you could sort of flip between the two, and it's like, is the Christ idea and the conscience idea just a moral thing? Should I kill this poor woman? But it also comes up in things like, as you were saying, approaching women, and also in stuff like procrastination as well. Like, that's not a moral thing, but the voice always goes, maybe even stronger than ever, saying, why are you sitting here masturbating in front of the computer? Like, why don't you actually go and do something with your miserable, pathetic little life? And then most of the time you don't listen to it, and you just keep masturbating in front of the computer. But it wears you down. And then what does it take for someone to get out of that? Is to put a picture or a motivational video of a great man to pull you out of that. Like, they've got millions of views, these things, like Gary Vee going, oh, you can start hustling, and everyone's like, oh, I wish I was Gary Vee. Yeah, Gary Vee's got it. Or The Rock, or Arnold Schwarzenegger. They sort of act as those intermediary Christ type figures to pull you out of your bullshit. That's you can see the architecture all over the place.
Yes, it's brilliant.
It's just very, very interesting to me.
And I think what's so interesting about it is it's so tangibly real when you're there in that moment. What I really thought about what Ion presented to us that really helped us was that it articulated this, and when you compare that to your experience, you're like, holy shit, that's actually what happens. Like, there is this logos of conscience that whispers. Now, is that Christ? We don't know, but it kind of seems like Christ, and we'll get to that now in a second. And then there's this other problem where you're always presented with this eros, this emotion that wants you to focus on the instant, short-term, feeling-based, oftentimes pleasure-based experience. Like, even with the woman, your eros, your fear is actually trying to keep you in a state of comfort, in a state of pleasure. And so we have this idea that pleasure is good. Pleasure is it's easier not to do, not to walk up and risk getting blown the fuck out by some girl and getting embarrassed and all that. It's easier for you to hold back and all that stuff. And it's the same with everything in that regard. And so you have this, I guess you could say, archetypal challenge in every moment. Like, what we're sort of doing here is we're abstracting morality and moral choices. You have this challenge between what is the emotional eros experience in any moment, and what is the logos, the logical, the right thing to do. And that's something you'll notice about the conscience, is it's always telling you something, and you'll notice in a weird way that it's almost always right. Like, when you're procrastinating and it whispers and says, you probably shouldn't do that, and you're like, you start rationalizing, you're like, no, I'll be fine, I'll do it, and like, next time I'll sort this out. Food is another one. It's like, I probably shouldn't eat that Mars bar. And then the next time you're like, no, next time I'll eat it this time, but next time I won't. And you start bullshitting yourself, but you know that that's right. Always. It always is. And so what I think the Jungian perspective that reinvigorated the Christian perspective for me in some sense was that he was saying that Christ was the representation of a man who ultimately defeated Eros. And that happened in that moment in the Gospels. In Matthew, it's one of the first paragraphs in the entire story of Christ, where you have Christ on the top of the world, and you have Satan, the complete personification of Eros, if you will. And some way we're reinventing the myth, but you're gonna have to let us do this if you want us to update it. Is that he personified that voice of Eros? So it's almost like now we have two voices. We have logos, the right thing; Eros, the thing that's kind of pulling you towards your bullshit, if you will. And that's present in all these scenarios. It's present with the woman, it's present with procrastination, it's present with food, it's present with moral choices, present with the old lady. It's always there. And so he turns into this naughty Satan and all that, and he's sort of like, do this and give in to the temptation. And then Christ is on the other hand, and Christ is sort of like, resist that Eros and do what is right. And his mission is very abstract, because who he is he's the son of God, and he has to die, he has to complete a destiny. And so like we start off and we're like, the woman, the old woman eating food and all that shit, and it's kind of like low stuff. But I guess if you got to the really high point in your life where you have to make a big choice, perhaps maybe this is where Christ was at. He was at that kind of pinnacle moment in a man's life where he's like, what am I going to die for? What am I going to represent in my life? And that becomes a bigger thing. But it's almost like this was the archetype that he conquered in some sense. He threw away Eros ultimately. And so when you choose him as a hero, you're choosing, I guess you could say, logos ultimately, or the right thing ultimately, or you're choosing this idea of always conquering Eros. And in some sense, that can be risky. Maybe you suppress it, but it's not like he's saying you should suppress it. It's just that you have to put it, like he doesn't say, kill you, Satan. He says, get behind me. So it's like take second priority to me, which is very interesting. And that's what becomes an interesting thing. Like if you're asking yourself, what would Jesus do? Maybe, I don't know, maybe the modern Christians have misinterpreted this and sort of done it like all woman is sin. But maybe the correct way to understand Christianity is to be like, Jesus would do the thing that the conscience says at all times, because he is your conscience. In some sense, maybe the man himself actually does exist in this sort of astral plane. And every time you hear that conscience speaking, you think it's my conscience, but it's not you. You're the one, you're the rational bullshitter that's like trying to argue. Whatever's speaking could be someone else's voice. Who knows? Any thoughts, sir?
Yeah, I've got a lot of thoughts on this. I will clear up. You're going to be attacked by some hardcore Jungians who like really know what they're talking about by saying that Logos is defeating Eros, because implicit in that is the idea that you need Logos and you don't want Eros. That's a functional interpretation, because most of the Eros you're going to come up against is going to be temptation.
Yeah.
But in the Christian story, there is high expressions of Eros. For example, Christ is a very loving man. You have the love of the Father for his Son, and that's why he died. And of course, you've got music as well throughout the gospel, not the gospels, throughout the Bible. You've got the Psalms, and the Psalms, of course, were songs. So you could almost think of it, if you've got a very attention to detail-y brain, as the higher expression of logos, which is the conscience. You can also have lower expressions of logos too, like your nonsense rationality telling you yeah, which is like logos hijacking Eros. They're very confusing definitions. You could think of the Christ story as the higher expression of logos defeating the lower expression of Eros, so that you can bring on the higher expression of Eros, right? Because if you get rid of the lower nonsense, then you can bring on love and you can bring on everything else. So just a little caveat there. I will say though, I want to get into Jung a little bit. The way Jung looked at these, at the evolution of Christian morality, I guess in a Nietzschean sense, where he looked at his genealogy of morals, Jung did the same thing, and he thought it was linked somewhat astrologically, of course. So we had the Aeon of Aries. I always forget that one. I think it's the Aeon of Aries, then the Aeon of Pisces, and then the Aeon of Aquarius. And he sort of matched this up against loads of different characters throughout history, and the most important one he came across was Joachim of Fior, who we've talked, of course, a lot about in our Ion lectures. But the idea seems to have gone through a series of psychological elevating levels of consciousness. So it starts off as rules and laws to say, do X, don't do Y, and they come from God. And that's the Mosaic law, where, of course, you've got your 10 commandments. And it's like, you don't break these 10 commandments for anything. It's like, well, okay, that's fair enough. And that's what the Jews did for a long time. And then Christ was a heretic for multiple reasons. But the biggest one was he came and he changed the laws, where the scribes and Pharisees said to him, Jesus, why are you fucking with Moses' laws? And he turned around and said, I have not come to fuck with the laws. I've come to fulfill the laws. Because he started doing very interesting things, where he broke the Sabbath law, for example. He started, dancing around on the Sabbath day, healing people and picking corn. They were like, you can't do that. Look, it's written there specifically, you can't do it. And he goes, think about it, boys. Think about why that's there in the first place. And the other classic example is the adultery one, where he says, yeah, don't commit adultery, but don't look at women either, because that leads to adultery. So Christ almost comes along and goes, this is dead words that are just laws to get you to stop eating babies and killing each other. Let's make it more sophisticated as we go along. And that's what he did. He turned it into like a form of sophisticated psychology. And what Jung and Joachim believed was that the next stage beyond that was this conscience stage, where rather than going to scripture and reading what Christ said, because it's we'll say more psychologically sophisticated than the Mosaic law, that might be a contentious thing to say, but I think that's fair. You have more nuance and stuff built into there. The next stage is Christ is always with you, which is this idea at the very last line of the Gospel of Matthew, where he says, I will be with you even until the end of the world, or in some translations, age, which is like ion. Right? I'll be with you until the end of the ion, which means he's always there and he's always listening to you. So either Christ is in this ethereal realm and he's talking to you and going through praying to me, I'll tell you, or something very, very strange happened. And this is an idea so Jung put this forth, if you're interested. It's in volume 18 of his collected works called The Symbolic Life. He has an essay called On Resurrection. And he says that it's quite Nietzschean in a way, actually, that where the Jews were so oppressed by the Romans, basically, they weren't having a great time around the dawn of that, 2 millenniums ago. They were sort of like, if you've seen Monty Python and the Life of Brian, it's kind of like that. They're looking for a messiah because they can't take it anymore. They're all being crucified. So psychically, they went through a shift which coincided astronomically in the stars, where they started to project onto this poor rabbi, basically Jesus, who's just going around minding his own business, maybe being quite profound, and they all their minds together project onto him the self. And the self of the collective is the ultimate extension of what a man can be. So Christ, he might not have been divine literally, but he becomes that particular figure from the projection. So when you talk about Christ, you're activating that part of the collective unconscious, which gives you a hint of who you could possibly be in the future. And that's the whole Christian conscience idea, is Christ equals conscience. So whenever you're going around and you're thinking to yourself, what should I do? What should I do? The will of God is the conscience, but it's also Christ. And it's going, do that, because it leads to some kind of promised land. And we don't know what that is. It might be a literal kingdom in the sky. It might be a physical kingdom here on earth. We don't know. But psychological law dictates, for some reason, this is how we're built, you have to obey it, or you don't have a very good mentally sound time. If that makes any sense, Stefan.
And it does, and this is where I'd like to start articulating this. And this is going to be a re-articulation of something we talked about in Ion, but it's like this choice does not present to you as you said before, as your rationality versus your instincts. This actually comes up to you if you think about it and be sincere. It comes up to you as two feelings. You have this kind of gut feeling that you should go and help the lady across the road, and it kind of comes along with a voice, but it's a feeling, and it's almost like it's kind of accompanied by a little bit of fear as well. And a little bit of annoyance. You're kind of like, oh, I just heard that little fucker tell me that. And then the other side of it is you have that desire, and that's usually got like a great amount of momentum behind it that's pulling you towards this thing. And the biggest problem for you is in some sense stopping that. That's the really hard thing. It's almost like, so there's this little war going on inside of you. And in some sense, this logos thing, as I said earlier, is telling you to do the right thing. And if of course your logos, if Hercules is sitting there and that's the representation of your conscience, what it will say often, or Tyler Durden will say, go beat up all those cars and protect that old lady, or maybe let the old lady die. She's too weak anyway. Maybe that's what happened. A bit of a straw man, but you get what I'm saying here. It's like maybe that's what would manifest out of this. But if you place Jesus Christ there, what happens is you get a very specific message, and it's about something that seems to work as a very useful mode for creating a kingdom, a good society. Because I guess as we moved out of the time of heroes and the time of empires and all that, motherfucking airplanes, and the time of empires and all that, just raw domination became less useful, and what we needed then was something like, we could say, a high trust society. And one of the most important aspects of high trust society is, for example, altruism, the ability to, I guess, know that people are going to stick to their logo, stick to their word in all that sense. And so if you have Christ as the thing that everybody's following, it becomes a very, very functional, meta-ordered system in that type of sense. And so if everybody kind of surrenders themselves to this Christian story, to Christ, and then it from there streams down into their conscience and leads them to make these type of choices, what will happen over time is that the society they're a part of will start to form into the kingdom of heaven. And so in some sense, this is the ultimate form of health. So like Christ is promising a kingdom in the future, but it's like if you believe in him, what happens is he takes the role of your hero, and then your conscience starts to sort of guide you in this way. He kind of possesses you in a way. And then what you do is you do all this stuff and you work towards the good and all this stuff. And then what happens is, you know, you start building that thing, and then you find actually there's a load of dudes who want to work towards the good. They don't want to go playing lute on Saturday night. They actually want to go and build a cathedral. And then what do you know, 100 years later, you've got a motherfucker like this sitting around next door. And it starts to just grow and grow and get bigger and bigger and bigger. It's like an upward spiral. And the more people who get involved in it, the more they kind of integrate together. And that becomes very, very positive. It's a very, very good thing. And so in some sense, I hear people like Jordan Peterson and all them talk about individualism a lot. And I think this would be the ideal way of understanding it, is that if you are part of a society where everybody is a part of this superordinate way of thinking, it becomes very, very fucking... I'm getting spied on by choppers up here. I don't know, can you hear that? Oh my good
just
Lord.
Just a little bit, yeah.
Oh my days, what's going on there? But yes, you get that superordinate experience, and then everybody kind of collects together and they start building something together. But it's not I guess you could say, in that sense, it's not collective. They're all doing it as individuals, and it's this psychological trick that makes individuals work together and forms a good collective. It's sort of like a grassroots way of doing it, a decentralized way of doing it, you know. So it builds from the ground up. Person by person, the conquest of this logos happens. And then once that happens society-wide, society grows out of the ground. Any thoughts before I go on to what happens if you give in to Eros, perhaps?
Yeah. You mentioned individualism. Individualism is, you know, these are words which people don't really know what they mean. And it's like, in this particular context, it's the focus on building the kingdom has to be localized to the individual. But by extension of that is a collective idea. Because, you know, Christ didn't come along and go, you do you and you do you. He says, I am your king and I am the best boyo. You know, so they have a shared thing in common. It's not as if you can go out and do whatever you want. And I think a lot of the time when people like to critique individualism, they miss that point where everyone will still be individuals, like in Monty Python. Again, we're all individuals. If you get that reference, congratulations. But they're all working together for a bigger project. It might be a psychological project, like we want to not kill each other and have a happy, meaningful life. Or it could be a physical kingdom, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter in that instance.
Yeah, and it's a very, like, that's just such a profound idea for me, because it's saying that in that moment, like, you know, people are like, how do we save the world and all this shit? And in that moment where you give in to your fear, when you're seeing that beautiful girl and you say, no, I'm not going to do it, I'm too scared. But you don't say that to yourself. What you do is you say, she's too busy, she'll probably won't even like me anyway. Oh, I'm kind of tired. Oh, I'm not going to bother. That's what you do. But then you give in to the Eros. You're pulling yourself away from, I guess you could say, Logos and Christ in some sense, doing the right thing, doing what your conscience orders in some sense. And so what happens is you're actually, in some sense, committing a sin against the future kingdom. You're giving into Eros. You're giving into this instant gratification, short-term thinking. You could say cowardly. You could say smaller. You could say more decaying, more entropic, more degenerate way of thing. Something's going down. Instead of pushing yourself upwards, you're going downwards towards that. Whereas if you accept it, you take that step forward and you make this tiny gain, and then you keep doing that and it gets stronger and you start to, I guess, live by that. But this is more about giving yourself over to the feeling. And this is what I'm really trying to drill home. It's not reason. Your reason is actually follows whichever of these you choose. So this is so weird about free will, because when your conscience speaks, you don't really have a choice to decide what it says. That's what we think of free will as. We think, okay, I'm going to do what I think is right. But what really happens is you sort of get just a binary choice. You get this conscience that says, do this, you bitch. And then you get this Eros which says, do this, bitch. And it's almost like your only free will is to choose between these in some sense. But you still have it. And what happens is your rationality will just, like, I guess Sam Harris blown the fuck out. Like, your rationality will just follow whatever one you choose. You choose the Eros, your rationality will be like, oh, the girl was busy, or the grandmother was going to do it fine anyway, or I won't eat Mars bars from now on. Like, you'll be fine. Like, you say that your reason does that, but if you choose the conscious thing, your reason will sort of be like, fucking fair play for actually going through with it, motherfucker. Well done, Jesus Christ. And I try to do that again, you know? And it's a different type of feeling. And even, like, you know, you go talk to the girl and she's like, oh my God, leave me alone, or something like that. You still kind of say, well, you did it anyway. Fair play. Well done, you did it anyway. Your reason follows that thing. You know what I mean? And so
I wanted to make this just a little bit wackier for a moment because I quite enjoy that kind of stuff. Take the example of my dog's getting very, very excited at this idea. He's like, let's do it. Take the idea of that girl, and you want to approach this beautiful girl. What's the ultimate consequence of not approaching the girl? And the answer there are many answers. The two of you might have actually built a literal Roman Empire together. Who knows? But the most likely implausible scenario is you actually, she's your future wife and you marry her and you have kids. One of the things Jung thought the conscience was, this is really weird, was your future self trying to manifest itself in the present. Because if you exist across time, it needs to manifest itself here in order to get to where it is. So it's almost like the invisible hand of God trying to force you to go down the right path, which is really weird. So in that scenario, which you might think is just simply a test of nerves, a test of courage to go and approach that girl, it might literally be, if Jung's to be believed, of course, your future self trying to point out who your wife is, which is very, very strange.
And if you don't do it, you can think, and this is what we're going to talk about here, is like what happens if you give into the Eros. Because what you notice is that when you give into the Eros, what your mind will do is tell you that there are no consequences for surrendering or for failing, if you will. There are no consequences. Because when you don't go talk to the girl, you remain in your comfort zone and you're like, oh, that's fine. My inaction didn't have any consequences. And the reality is, it's like, and this is where it gets scary, and this is where it gets hard, and this is where it gets, I guess you could say, interesting, is that there's no escaping. You don't get to not make a choice. You're either choosing Logos or you're choosing Eros. And so when you say, I'm not going to do it, you're bringing yourself one step closer to being trapped in your mother's basement, playing video games, being called incel or some shit like that. You know what I mean? Like,
well, yeah. And so you could also reframe that as you get to decide, like actually you get to decide how the universe manifests itself. Which it's like, well, it would have happened anyway. And it's like, well, no, because if the way the universe manifests itself depends on your actions, you are the one creating the universe. That is actually a fact.
Yes. And this is where we start getting this idea then, of course, is that if you're participating in that, and every time you talk to the girl, you help the granny across the road, you actually create this snowball effect that leads us to like the St. Peter's Basilica. You know what I mean? Like, it's like hard to make those connections, but I guess what we learned from Jung is that he's sort of saying, oh, there's a fucking connection, boyo. There's a connection, and it's huge. And then what happens is if you, I guess if you surrender and you will keep rationalizing and saying there's no consequence at all. And you'll notice that this is the exact line of thinking that goes into any of this type of nihilistic thinking, is that people say there's no purpose and no consequences. And that's what's so interesting, is that that's the rationalization your brain does. When you don't approach the girl, there's no consequences. It doesn't matter. And in some sense, that's important for you to understand that you can always try again and you'll be okay. Like if you, the next time, and you actually do it, like that does have a result. But in some sense, you have to take the responsibility and admit that, you give in, you surrender to the Eros, and then that causes a spiral. Kind of, I guess you could say it punches you dopamine wise, and you kind of feel a little niggling bit of shame, and then the next time you see a girl, your confidence is worse, and then you avoid it again, and then something happens at work and you're not really in a good mood because you didn't talk to that girl, and then shit, it's spiral downward, and you're suddenly in quote unquote hell. And then if you map that snowball effect to a society scale, say everybody starts doing this, the best example is the inability to stand up and draw boundaries and talk about principles and talk about truth and all that stuff, is that you end up in as we've talked about before, you end up in the Soviet Union situation where suddenly everybody lost like all those things they'd taken for granted, which is the ability to just exist without ending up in a gulag. It was all gone, And so how does that connect? Did that happen because the Russians in some sense weren't standing up when they saw the resentment of the weak start to appear? They weren't turning around and saying, listen, motherfucker, shut the fuck up. You don't know what you're talking about here. And like, how did that work? Where was this connection in some sense? Was it down to hundreds of years of people cucking, sacrificing Logos for the sake of Eros, for the sake of that easier feeling, that feeling which is hate, that feeling which is resentment, that feeling which is fear, that feeling which is cowardliness? So this is a big question. And that question is difficult because that leads us to a position where it's like, like that process hasn't ended. Like it's not like, oh, the Soviet Union happened, very terrible lesson. That's good to know. It's like tomorrow, today, you will go out and you will have a conscience experience. And what you do, oh man, I'm so afraid saying these words because I have to live up to them, man. It's so hard. I'm actually, it's like I'm talking to myself. I know that I'm gonna go out and something's gonna happen, and I'm gonna be like, I just talked about this on YouTube, but not me. I don't have to do it.
Yeah.
I'm special. It's always like that. But yes,
This is what happened when we were actually recording the Ion lectures. Like behind the scenes, it was constantly like, so I have to say the truth at all times, or else the Soviet Union will come. All of us having mental breakdowns. It was great fun.
Oh man, this is so annoying me now. Fuck. Okay, right. It's like, well, I was gonna have ice cream today. Like, fuck. But it's like that problem, you know, where you it will happen immediately in your life, and you know, and you have that niggling voice, and you know, and you will avoid it, and you'll keep avoiding it, and at some point, the world will keep getting worse, and what will happen is you'll turn around, and you'll start blaming other people. Oh, it's them that are taking my reality from me. And maybe it is, maybe they are, but how do you know that those people up there, like if you're on the left, it's the rich. If you're on the right, it could be other types of rich people. And what you will realize is that you'll start blaming these. You start being like, oh, I resent those and all that. It's very easy. It's like, oh, it's their fault. But they only appeared and they only take advantage of you because you didn't do this 50 years ago, or your ancestors didn't do this. And what you're going to do is you're going to keep that spiral going until at some point you turn around, you just say, it stops with me. And maybe that's what Christ was. Like, he showed up when the Jews were very resentful towards the Romans. And maybe that was him showing up and being like, guys, let's stop being resentful. Let's do something else here. And that's why a load of them went with him. They were like, yeah, actually, fuck, that's a great idea. And then the others didn't. And what happened? Judea was crushed by Rome then afterwards and left them in that like position where they were wandering through the world with no homeland. And like, how did Christ predict that? Jesus, I don't know. It's crazy stuff, but it's something to think about. Something to think about in the big picture and the political stuff. So, any last thoughts, Jimithy?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very depressing thought, which is basically like if you break your no-nut streak, or if you eat some bad food, you're going to create the Soviet Union, which of course is, and I don't want to say this because this automatically becomes a voice in your head, that is hyperbole. Like, you eat ice cream, you're not going to create the Soviet Union, but it's the first step. And because obviously you eat the ice cream, over a long period of time, you get fat, you get miserable, you start hating yourself, everything falls around you, and then you start voting for communist government parties, or you don't stand up for yourself when evil is happening around you. But there is, of course, a positive flip side to that, which is how much good could you be manifesting in your own little kingdom of God? And this, of course, is the clean your room idea. Clean your room equals create the kingdom of God. It's like you can create a physical one around you by cleaning your room, but like, in terms of fixing up your relationship, are you calling home to your old mum every so often to make sure that she's doing okay? Because if she passes away and you haven't called her or told you that you loved her in a while, that's going to beat you up. That happens to people all the time. Little tiny things like that to make sure that everything around you is put together properly. And that, of course, puts you on the road towards heaven, which is, I guess, a nicer, more motivational way of framing it, rather than, stop masturbating, or you'll create the gulag system again.
And I guess that is the fundamental conclusion that we derived out of this, is that there's something very profound about, I guess you could say, Jung's frame on Christianity that is incredibly empowering, in the sense that, and this is something Nietzsche throws at Christianity a bit, which I find interesting, is he says it is a myth for the powerless. But what's weird is that in this frame, what they are saying is that no matter how small you are, no matter how much you think you don't have power, you always have the power of a choice. Yes. And that's what's so profound about what Christ's story was, is that he was essentially saying to reality, it's like, you can kill me, but you cannot break me. And if you kill me without breaking me, I will take over the world. And they killed him, and they did not break him. And then he became king of the Roman Empire, the greatest empire in the world at that time. He actually, it happened, It wasn't some joke. He was saying, maybe I'll lose my life, but you will never be able to take, I guess the idea is that you can take my life, but you cannot take my soul. That type of idea. You can kill me, but you cannot kill what I represent. You can kill me, but you cannot kill goodness, because goodness is not of this world. It is not made of stuff. It exists in us all, and you'd have to delete all of humanity to get rid of it. It's inside of us all, and trust me, as long as my story gets out there, people will follow on this path and lead us towards goodness in some sense. And that's just a unbelievably profound idea. And Nietzsche, even himself, like, he's a very ardent critiquer of Christianity, but you find a couple of passages where he just confesses in this way. He's saying Christianity, and he says this about Buddhism as well, but because it's European, Christianity has to be credited for its ability to take the common man, the powerless person, and lift them out of the dangers of falling into the clutches of resentment and give them a way to access higher order truths and all that. And this is truly something profound about it. Like, no matter how much you want to think yourself as like a great Herculean Nietzschean man, like, Christ is always a very, very profound inspiration, no matter what level you are. Like, Nietzsche oscillated between Dionysius and Christ and all that. And it is revolving around that idea of this was a humble man who died with 12 followers, and he's literally probably the most famous person on earth right now. And like, it's impossible to quantify the amount of hope he has given the world. And that is all down to this idea of overcome what is negative, overcome what is degenerate, overcome what is evil in some sense. And it's just amazing thought, and so inspiring, I find. So that's what I think is great about it.
Yeah, I'd like to, I guess, swap roles with you for a second. Usually it's me, Steelman, in Christianity, and you taking a more Nietzschean frame. I want to critique Christianity for a moment too.
Okay, give us 1 second. I'll just transition over to the faces.
Oh, very nice.
Beautiful.
Oh, is that me I can see? That's very nice.
It should be. Wait.
Although I do look like I've frozen, except I'm speaking.
Okay, there you go.
All right, sweet. Okay. A lot of modern day Christians and Christian institutions miss the point. They missed the point. And that was Jung's critique as well. He was like, yeah, Christianity is a wonderful thing. Look, we're defending Christ. I'm doing really good work for you, but you're not helping yourself out because you're obsessed with weird stuff like rituals. You're like, you meet up every Sunday and you engage in the transubstantiation. And we talk about, oh, Jesus died on the cross. Well, in which case we're going to heaven as long as we obey these several little laws. They start turning the words of Christ into some kind of strange message. Whereas the Jungian idea was like, no. And there's an example that you can use if you're interested in, I guess, getting into the more Christian side of stuff yourself to make it practical. It's like, well, how do I get into this? Because say you want to go down a Catholic route and go, well, how do I do this? It's very, very dense, very, very dense. You come up against people like Thomas Aquinas, and you are anyone who said they've actually read Thomas Aquinas, it's like either you're insane, and I respect that, but you're insane, or you are lying, because his book is like this freaking thick, and it's all the details about theology, and it's like, and he wrote that for the layman. It's like, no one's going to read that. You're missing the point. What is the point? And the idea is, and I've seen this happen to a few boyos who hang out in our Discord server. They've prayed to Christ, and they've actually sat there, meditated for a while, and they prayed and gone, it's lots of meditative techniques go into this, but it's things like giving gratitude, understanding what you're responsible for and what you're not responsible for, and just asking for help and asking for guidance. And, you could, of course, take a biological frame and say, well, you've calmed your neural circuit so that the voice of conscience, which is your guide to navigate this horrible Darwinian world, comes up. Or you could just ride that wave, that synchronicity wave, and see to yourself, is this powerful? And is this a tool that you can feel? Because another point with Jungian psychology, and this cannot be stressed enough, it is not a rational endeavor. It is a balance between logos and eros. And wherever gods or the gods live, it is not in the words that we speak. It is in the eros of the imagination and in dreams. That's where everything is bubbling up. You have to feel it properly. When someone says, this is one of the reasons why Jordan Peterson says he doesn't believe in God, he's got loads of them, but one of them certainly is because God is not a word that you say. God is a feeling that you feel. You feel Christ is driving you. You're actually motivated neurophysiologically to be a good person. It's not simply words that you say. So you have to try this out yourself.
Yes, it's empirical, as they say. I guess I would like to close this on the idea of meaninglessness and nihilism. And that is what I found so profound about this. And I think this is why people get so in touch with this. I think this is why people found this to be such a brilliant idea, is that we are stuck in this position, the postmodern conundrum, where we don't know what to do. We don't know what's right. We don't know what reality is. We don't know what the right goal is and all that. And the problem underneath that is there's this sort of anti-entropy underneath it. I don't think anti-anthropic take where we don't believe in people. We don't believe in ourselves. We don't believe that we're good. We don't believe that if we just did it, it would turn out well. We think of ourselves as evil. We think of humans as inherently monstrous and evil in some sense. And that disempowers us and turns us into sort of, we hate ourselves. We see ourselves as these beasts that are destroying the world, consuming the world, and ripping apart the environment, causing global warming, and just hollowing out anything that is good. And then on the flip side, we think of ourselves as like destroying the great society that we inherited and all this. And there's this doubt, this skepticism towards who we are to a large extent. And what I think this puts back on the plate, and so profoundly, is this idea that you can understand that if you fight this fight that goes on in your mind, and what's great about it is that it's like you can experience this today if you want. I'm not telling you something abstract. I'm not being like, yo, like, did you hear about, like, you know, the shape of the world and all this? Like it's more to do with, you can actually feel this. Like you can have the moral dilemma today. Just go out and just walk up and down the street until you see some crazy old lady trying to zip across, and then you'll feel it. You know what I mean? But it's that dilemma is there, and what will show you is that the problem between good and bad is not that does it exist in the world, it's that you haven't found it in yourself. And it wasn't that what Solzhenitsyn said after he was in the gulag for all that time. He was like, the line between good and evil does not go between, I don't know, communist, capitalist, whatever, all that bullshit, right or left. He says it goes down between the human heart. And this is where you kind of feel it, is in those moments when you have this inkling, what is the right choice? And then you have to go for it. And that's a great testament to how you can dig yourself out of, I guess, anything. You can say you can start your life for the first time ever. You can say, I'm going to empirically test this stuff and see where does it bring me. And Christ will, I guess what I think is so interesting about Christianity is Christ sort of holds your hand, and maybe he's not the final thing there. Maybe it's about you, but nonetheless, he holds your hand and takes you in the first couple of steps. And that's very accessible for most Europeans. And from there, you can start leaping off into other stuff. But it just shows you that the probably the key thing about building a better boyo, if you will, is about learning how to build your moral sense, your conscience, learning how to conquer your eros, conquer your inner gratification and all this, and develop something which you could say a sharpness of soul, if you will. And that alone will pull you out of that nihilism, pull you out of that self-hate. You'll realize that I'm not exactly a good person, but I'm not destined to be a bad person either. And this is shared with all of humanity. Everybody has a choice, you know. Everybody can change if they so will. And that I think that changes the world enough to kind of help you spiral out of a lot of bullshit. Quite a lot of bullshit. It doesn't answer all the questions either, but it sets a good foundation. And I like it for that reason. And this is why I'm saying stay juicy and try it out. Any final thoughts, sir?
Yes. Everyone makes New Year's resolutions, and everybody likes to turn over a new leaf every so often. You know, I'm going to improve myself. And it was said of Christ. He said that no one can enter the kingdom of God unless he becomes born again. It's not enough to be born once, you have to be born again. And that's what baptism is. So next time you're thinking to yourself, I want to turn over a new leaf, because no matter what you want to say, you do think that all the time. Because if you're here watching this video, guaranteed your life is not put together. Like 100%, because you'd be off there getting after it. And that's not an insult to the audience, of course. But it's the same thing, right? It's the same thing as us making this, right? What could we do if we really had ourselves properly put together? So the invitation from Christ and the invitation from all of those same ideas which stemmed from him is become born again and see what happens. And you can do that right now. And all it takes is for you to close your eyes and listen to what might be there talking to you from God knows where.
Yeah, beautiful. Let's call it at that. Motherfuckers, are you ready? Go out there and listen to your conscience. Bet you never heard that. You didn't expect that. Go out there and listen to that conscience. Go on and be get juicy and stay well. And that is, I guess you could say, the Uber meme that came out of the ion stuff. And there's some things I'd like to elaborate on later about like the nature of the conscience and all that. I'll get into that in other videos and all this. But this is a nugget that I hope you enjoyed and we found very enlightening and challenging to come in contact with ourselves. So thank you very much, and we will talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Amen.
Amen. Amen.